Reverend Dr. Anthony Scott, and it is my privilege to be with you on this journey in your life as a congregation and community. I have been appointed as your JEDI consultant. I've met with Vivian and Clark to hear about the aims of the grant, and I'm also looking forward to our time together as we press toward the ethic of the eighth principle. The journey, the jihad, the struggle of anti-racism is difficult. To strive against racism is to travel against the grain, against the flow of accepted social norms. The work of anti-racism requires introspection and honesty and grief. When I speak of introspection, I'm not suggesting the, quote, navel-gazing, unquote, to which the work of introspection is so often reduced. I'm speaking of the type of self-examination which leads to a changed mind, which leads to a new way of being in the world, which is expressed in transformational, revolutionary, radical action which impacts persons and communities and institutions and systems within your sphere of influence. An example of the beginnings of such introspection can be found in The Hidden Wound, a book by Wendell Berry. He writes, "It occurs to me that for a man whose life from the very beginning has been conditioned by the lives of Black people, I have had surprisingly little to say about them in my other writings. Perhaps this is justifiable, and yet it has been an avoidance. When I have written about them before, I have felt I was doing little more than putting down a mark, leaving an opening that I would later have to go back and fill. For whatever reasons, good or bad, I have been unwilling until now to open in myself what I have known all along to be a wound. A historical wound prepared centuries ago to come alive in me at my birth like a hereditary disease, and to be augmented and deepened by my life. If I had thought it was only the Black people who have suffered from years of slavery and racism, then I could have dealt fully with the matter long ago. I could have filled myself with pity for them and would no doubt have enjoyed it a great deal and thought highly of myself. But I am sure it's not so simple as that. They have nevertheless suffered greatly. The cost has been greater than we yet know. If the white man has inflicted the wound of racism upon Black men, the cost has been that he would receive the mirror image of that wound into himself. As the master or member of the dominant race, he has felt little compulsion to acknowledge or speak of it. The more painful it has grown, the more deeply he has hidden it within himself. But the wound is there, and it is a profound disorder, is a great damage in his mind as it is in his society. In his time of introspection and contextual reflection, his Sitz im Leben, his setting in life, and he saw and likened the impact of racism to a wound in his body and the bodies of all persons without regard to identity in the specific American racial identity binary of Black and white. It's a wound in the body politic, which is deep and has gone without treatment for centuries. This type of wound, deep and festering, is best addressed through a process called healing by secondary intention. There are two approaches to healing wounds of the flesh. Primary and secondary. You see, primary intention is what medical professionals and most patients really want to do. It is taking two sides of a wound and closing them up with stitches or with staple. Here's a wound and lickety split, put it back together, keep it dry for a few days, and the scarring will be minimal. That's what you get your Neosporin for. This is what folks want. Quick healing. Reunited and it feels so good type healing. Can barely see the scar healing. Forgot it was ever there healing. Now, healing by secondary intention is something altogether different. Healing by secondary intention is practiced when the sides of the wound are not clean cut. They're not able to be drawn together because a chunk of flesh is missing due to a trauma, an infection, or some other decay of the flesh and tissues. With healing by secondary intention, the healers recognize that the healing can't be done by drawing the sides together. No, the healing has to occur from the bottom of the wound upwards. And this is done by a lengthy process of cleaning the wound and packing the wound and unpacking the wound and over and over and over again, the same process until the healing has happened from the bottom, the depths of the wound, to the top. What can be discerned with the eye. Healing by secondary intention is not a short process. It's not a pointless process. It's not a painless process. It's not a gross-free process. It's not a happy process. The process of healing must be matched to the severity of the wound. Racism is trauma. Racism, as expressed as a white skin, a white thought, a white action supremacy, is the cause of a massive wound in the body politic. The depth and the breadth of which is not really known. So often this wound, which lives in the bodies, yes, the bodies, the CDC now understands racism to be a social determinant of health. It lives in the minds, foundations like the Hogg Foundation, like other foundations of centers of research, has released a statement acknowledging a fact that non-white people have known all along, that, quote, "We acknowledge the impact of racism, sexism, and other structural oppressions on mental health and speak out against these oppressions even when it's challenging to do so," end quote. It even lives in our DNA. The National Institutes of Health now recognizes that there are transgenerational effects of racial discrimination which are epigenetic. That the conditions are so severe that it changes an individual's, alters an individual's, a community's genes. They raise in terms of raised cortisol and depression and anxiety and high blood pressure. The wound is so deep that its boundaries cannot be discerned. The wound caused by the trauma of racism lives in everybody's body, white bodies included. An unacknowledged wound is still a wound, and it grows in the darkness of silence. I suggest for us a construct that I've developed facing our fears. It's an acronym: fears, faith formation, education, accountability, reflection, and sorrow. Faith formation: which traditions lend themselves to your moral and ethical center? How can you draw on these resources in your individual and communal struggle against racism? Education: which books and articles and videos and experiences might you engage to raise your consciousness about white supremacy and your engagement in and with that construct, and how such a construct might be dismantled and the harms it inflicts? A. The A is for accountability. This anti-racist journey has individual pieces, to be sure, but the work is communal. It is your community, your people, who can call you in and check in with you, and where you might reflect out loud. Where can you find such a community? R is reflection. This engages some of that work of introspection and some mining of your history or histories: personal, familial, communal, national, global. How will you make space for this reflection? And sorrow: where will you go with your grief? It occurs to me that most of the work of anti-racism and anti-racist education leaves out the element of grief. Sitting with your grief that comes from the dismantling gradually or suddenly of these constructs, the sense of self that is dismantled, that is ripped apart when one learns that they are racist without regard to their like of black people. Racism is not about like or dislike. Prejudice is. Racism is a systemic evil, a systemic oppression. What will you do with your grief? Will you allow your grief to be turned inward on itself? This grief looks like shutting down, refusing to engage for fear of being called out. Or you could let your grief be turned outward, but outwardly. Grief unprocessed often looks like anger and rage. Haven't we seen that in our national news cycle lately? Or will you find a way to tend to the healthy process of grief that you might go through it to be transformed on the other side? Will you tend to it within your community? Well, I look forward to meeting each one of you, to hearing your experiences, and to charting a journey forward and inward toward the necessary agitation and a lasting healing. Blessed be.